We're up to El Rabbi Akiva here on the top of Chavtes, the third line down from the top. Arba Kroi Ksive. In the Parsha of Sotah, there are 4 psukim, and in each case, the Torah used the word Tumah, and those are all redundant. And therefore, the Gemara wants to know what Rabbi Akiva will derive from these 4 psukim. And we'll read the psukim very quickly. V'kina es ishto v'hi nitma'a. And then it says v'haisa im nitma'a. And then it says asher tista isha tachas isha v'nitma'a. And Rabbi Akiva doubles one of them because it says v'nitma'a. So the last of the 3, Tumah, is v'nitma with a vav. The vav is redundant, and therefore we learn it as if it says 2. So what do we derive from these 4 psukim, all of which tell us that she's asura al baila, v'nitma, chad lebal, chad leboel, chad lekuhuna, v'chad letruma. So we have one to generate an Isra al baila, another al Isra al bala, if her husband dies or divorces her. And then we have a third for the Isra that she becomes a zona through Masechet, and therefore she can no longer marry a Kohen. A Kohen is enjoined for marrying a zona. And fourth, she can no longer eat truma, which means that if she's a bas Kohen, Rashi explains, and normally the Torah allows a bas Kohen after her marriage terminates to go back to Beis Avia to eat truma, but this woman is pasul truma because she had a Masechet ish. Now it's interesting that Rabbi Akiva needs 2 psukim, one for the Isol Inase Lakuna and another one for the Isol Lechel Truma. And therefore Rabbi Yishmael says, I don't need 2 psukim, one for the Isor Kahuna and one for the Isor Truma. I could derive the Isor Kahuna with a Kal V'chomer from Truma. Tlasa Kroi Ksive. He only has 3 drashos of Tuma. He doesn't darshan the extra vav, like we discussed yesterday in the sheet of Rebbe, that we don't make a word into 2 based on the vav. So he's only left with 3 times Tuma. Chad lebal, chad leboel, so far okay. But here's where he parts ways from Rabbi Akiva. V'chad letruma and v'lekuna asya b'kal v'chomer. So I only need a pasuk to teach me that she's asura, that she's not allowed to eat truma. I don't need a special pasuk to teach me that she cannot marry a Kohen and she has a psul of a zona, because that I could derive from truma b'kal v'chomer. So Rabbi Akiva, who darshans the extra vav, he has 4 drashos, and Rabbi Yishmael responds by saying, I don't darshan the extra vav, but I only need 3 drashos, because the Isser li nase lekohen is derived with a kal v'chomer from the Isser which enjoins her from eating truma. Will Rabbi Yishmael mimai the Itzra krol truma? The Gemara now raised the following objection. How does Rabbi Yishmael know to skip a step and use one of the Tumah drashos for Truma? V'lekuna asa b'kal v'chomer. Dilma, why not say ki yitzrich lekahuna? V'letruma sharia. Maybe we should take the lesser chidush, which is the more chomer dike iser of nisuin lekahuna, and say that the Torah says that in this case of Safek, where she had Kini and Stira, we're not sure whether she had the Bias Nus or not. The Torah generates an Isur of Zona as far as marrying a Kohen is concerned, but there's no drasha because Rabbi Yishmael doesn't have a 4th drasha to derive that she's enjoined from Truma. So maybe we'll say the Torah would allow the Isur Kal of Truma. Amalach, Rabbi Yishmael responds, Mistabra Dumya Debalu Boel, that the 3rd drasha of Tumah should have a certain common denominator with the first 2 drashas of Tumah. The first 2 drashas teach me Debal U Deboel. And this is called Michayim, which means that she becomes Asur on the Baal, Asur on the Boel, because the Baal is alive and the Boel is alive. Is Ma Baal Boel Michayim, Af Truma Nami Michayim. Which means the following, that if she gets divorced from her husband, and now she wants to go back to eating Truma b'beis aviyah, so the Torah is telling me that even though she received a get from her Baal, and she would normally go back to the reshus of her father to eat Truma, but now the Torah is saying in this third Tumah that she has the status of a Zona as far as Truma, and she cannot return to eat Truma b'beis aviyah. And that's Michayim, because that's called Truma Nami Michayim. It means the Baal is alive. He divorced her, and she went back to Beis Aviyah. Lafuke Kahuna Diliachar Misa, as opposed to the Isa Kahuna, because we have to keep in mind the following, that as far as Grusha is concerned, it wasn't the Kini and Stira that generated her Isa to marry a Kohen, but rather the Torah prohibits a Kohen from marrying a Grusha. So the very moment that she is a Grusha, although that would generate a brand new Chiv derived from Tumah, a brand new Psul and an Isa Truma, because she would go back to Beis Aviyah, but as far as Kahuna is concerned, when the husband divorces her, then she's a Grusha. So Dal Mihachi, I don't need the Kini and Stira to generate an Isser of Nesui Kahuna. She's Pasal Psul Kahuna Midin Grusha. So the only possibility would be that the Torah wants to mechadish an Isser Nesui Kahuna in the case where her husband dies, because then she's an almana who's allowed to marry a Kohen, and the Torah is being mechadish that through Kini and Stira, she's not allowed to be, she's not allowed to marry a Kohen after her husband dies, even though she's an almana, but she has a din of a zona. But that's liachar misa. Then we're talking about a case where her husband died, and therefore it's not dumya, it's not similar to the two tumas of lebal leboel, and with in both cases in which the fellow is alive. So having accepted the logical principle of Rabbi Shmuel, called Dumya Debal Udeboel, that they're both Michayim, the Gemara turns this around into an objection to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva needed the extra vav, which was number 4, if you remember, of the Limudim, in order to guarantee that we could derive both the Isa Lakuna and the Isa Truma. So the Gemara says, well, what are you telling me, Rabbi Akiva? You're saying that if you only had one limud, then you would use that limud to derive the Iser Nesuin, and then I need a special limud for the Kal, namely for Truma. Wait a minute. What about Dumya Debalu Deboel? And the Gemara answers Leslie, that Rabbi Akiva did not accept it within the parameters of Hilchos Drashos and how, by what method we derive halachas from the Torah. He didn't accept this principle of Rabbi Shmuel that Dumya Debalu Deboel. And therefore, we would use this one pasuk, let's call it number 3, to derive the Iser Nesue Kahuna, because that's more chomer. And the reason why that's more chomer, the Mefarshim explain, is because on the tzad that she was mezana, then if she goes out after the death of her husband and marries someone else, she might be mezana tachtov, and then there's going to be a chiyuv misa. So Isa Kahuna really has within it, in the broader purview, a possibility of an Isa misa. So it's not just an Isa lav. And therefore it's more chomer than Truma, which at maximum would be an Isa lav, but could not generate a chiyuv misa. So we wouldn't have known that she's asura from Truma, because we would have used that third pasuk of Tuma to derive the Isa Nesue Kahuna. The Inami Isle. Now the Gemara offers a second possibility. Let's grant you the premise that Rabbi Akiva accepted the principle of Rabbi Akiva of Dumya debal u deboel, which is all michayim. Nevertheless, he says the following: Milsa diasya b'kavachomer tarich v'kosav lakra. What does this mean? So the truth is that if I accept the principle of dumya debalu deboel, then I know that the third pasuk is coming to generate an iser of truma. But nevertheless, even if we did not have the extra vav for the fourth tuma, then let's derive from the language of tuma an iser on truma. And that's based on the principle of dumya, debal, udebol, because truma, as we said earlier, is an iser that's generated b'chaya bal. Which means that even though she is a bas kohen and she should normally go back after gerushin to the rishus of her father, she doesn't, even though her husband is alive. And then we could l'chora derive the Isa to Kahuna of Nisui Kahuna from a Kal V'chomer, because let's keep in mind the Isa of Nisui Kahuna is more chomer insofar as in the broader perspective it lends itself to a Chiyav Misa. But we have a principle that Milsa the Asya Mikal V'chomer Parach V'kosav L'kra. The pasuk wants to go out of its way to teach us that which we could derive from a Kal V'chomer. Okay. Now, from now until the end of the daf, we're entering into the world of Tumah V'Tara. And this goes on even to daf Lamed. So we have to brace ourselves, for that part of Shas, which is a bit, of a stretch for us. And we saw at the end of the Brisa that Safek Tumah is Ketuma. And we derive this from Sotah. However, in Sotah, we have what's called Yeshbo Das Lishol, meaning that she could ask the question as to what her status is. Is she Asura, or, for example, the Boel, so-called Boel? And now what we're going to do is when we derive the laws of Tumah from Sotah, we're going to be limited and bound by the scope of Sotah. And since the scope of Sotah is Yeshlo Das Lishol, well, Lishol is a more proper pronunciation, then in Tumah, it's also going to be limited to Yeshbo Das Lishol. Amrav Gidol Marav, Dover Shi Yeshbo Das Lishol, let's say the word Dover She'ein Bo Das Lishol, Mehai Kro Nafka. We're not going to derive it from Sotah, but rather from the parsha of Korban Shlomim. Now, what's unique about Shlomim, of course, in the constellation of Zvachim, is that Shlomim is Bisaro Nechal Abaylim, and that's in the 7th chapter of Sefer Vayikra. Now, with regard to Basar Shlomim and the mitzvah of Achila, the Torah says, "V'abasar shayiga b'chol tomei lo ye'achel ba'eshi saref." So if you notice and you pay attention to the pasuk, it says "Asher yiga b'chol tomei," and the language of "Asher yiga b'chol tomei" implies "vadai tomei." And when the Torah says lo ye'achel, it's referring to a case of vadai tomei. Who de lo ye'achel? Has safek tomei, safek tar. If the basar may or may not have come in contact with tumah, and we really don't know, so we're in a state of safek ye'achel. The implication of the Torah is that it would be eaten. And this is based on a diuk in the pasuk. The Torah doesn't say asher yeh tameh, which would have been what we call a Lashon Stam, but rather the Torah used the language Asher Yiga, a Lashon of Negia B'Tumah, Asher Yiga B'Chol Tamim. And that implies a Negia Vadois. So now we come to the conclusion that Safek Tuma is Tar. And if we don't know for sure that the Basa came in contact with Tuma, then we're allowed to eat the Basa. However, we have a stira, a Masechet. Let's look at the end of that pasuk with regard to the mitzvah of eating basar shlom. It says, "V'basar kol tar yochal basar." Who's allowed to eat the basar of shlomim? Only a tar. And once again, we're going to be medayik for the lashon pasuk. And we're going to come to the conclusion that when it says kol tar, that the person who's eating the basar shlom is tar, that means we have to know that he's a vadai tar. The Torah is setting up a precondition for candidacy to eat the basar of shlomim. It's got to be vadai tar. Hu diyochal basar ha safek tumah safek tar lo yacha. So how do we reconcile this apparent contradiction regarding Safek Tumah? But here we have to notice, before we go on to the Gemara's answer, that's Rav Gidol Amarav's answer, we have two psukim that are talking about two different scenarios. Because the first pasuk, from which we derive that Safek Tar, Safek Tameh, is Ye'achel, that was a case where we weren't sure whether or not the basar was asher yiga, whether it came in contact with tumah. In the second case, the pasuk of basar called tar yochal basar were required that he be a vadei tar. They were talking about with the suffix is whether or not he who wants to eat the basar shlomim contracted tumah or not. Elav, says the Gemara, shmamino, the only way that we can reconcile this apparent contradiction regarding the case of the status of Safek is kan sheyesh bo das lishol, kan she'ein bo das lishol. In the first case, where the issue was a basar sheyiga, and we're talking about tumas basar, whether the basar contracted tumah or not, there we're going to say ein bo das lishol. Right, the basar cannot stand up and ask the question about itself. Did I become tummy? Did I not? Was there a maga with tumah? Was it not? So that's called ein bo das lishoel. And in such a case, the Torah is mekil in a case of safek, and therefore you're allowed to eat the basar. But in the second pasuk, about basar called tar yochal basar, then we're talking about tumas adam. We're not sure if this man himself contracted tumah. Well, that's yeshol das lishol. He can answer the question, in theory, whether or not he contracted tumah or not, and therefore we have to be machmer in a suffix, because that's called yesh bo das lishoel. So Rav Gidol and Rav are establishing that din in the Sefer that we said that suffix tumah is considered tameh, but only if it's yesh bo das lishoel. So then, in addition to the source for that distinction between yesh bo das lishol, where it's safek tameh, and ein bo das lishol, where it's safek tar, that we derive from Sotah, there's another possible derivation, which is offered here in the name of Rav, from the reconciliation of two psukim in the parsha of basar shlomim regarding the achila of basar shlomim. Whereas in the case of safek maga, where the suffix is in the basar, we're going to be makel in suffix because it's ein bo das lishol. In contrast, if he himself may or may not have contracted tumah, and it's a safek tumah, he's enjoined from eating the basar of shlomim because it's yesh bo das lishol. Now the Gemara wants to know, okay, now you have two sources from which you derive the exact identical conclusion. I need both of them. Number one, the Rav Gidol Amarav, I need the derivation to derive the distinction between Yesh Bo and Ein Bo Das Lishoel. V'itzrich L'Migmar, at the same time, I need to derive this distinction, Sotah, as we saw in the Bryce. Why? If I only had the drush of Rav Gidol Marav to derive it from the reconciliation of the two psukim in the parasha Basel Shalom Havamina, I would have come to the conclusion that in the case of Yesh Bo Das Li Shoel, where we said that he may have contracted tumah and may not have contracted tumah, but it's Yesh Lo Das Li Shoel, we would come to the conclusion that he's tameh, bein b'rishus hayachid, bein b'rishus harabah. The parsha of Shlomim makes no intimation at all that we should differentiate what rishus did the suffix arise in. And therefore, it's the Sotah. For that distinction, we need Sotah, as we discussed at great length yesterday, because Sotah is maximum 2 people. L'lamed, and this is going to teach me that in the case of Yesh Bo Das Li Shoel, the Tumah is only in a case of Rishus Hayachid. The Sotah, if I only had the derivation from Sotah, although I would know the difference between Rishus Hayachid and Rishus Harabim, and the suffix that generates Tumah and Isur is only in Rishus Hayachid, but Havamina, I would have thought that it's only considered Dover Sheyesh Bo Das Li Shoel Adeika Das Nogea Umagia. In the case of Sotah, there's a double Yesh Bo Das Lishol, both on the part of the Isha and on the part of the Boel. Both of them could be asking, are they Torah? Are they Talmud? Do they have this violation of morality? So therefore, I would assume, based on the equation to Sotah, that this halacha of Safek Kivadai only applies when there's ikadas, both the Nogea Umagia. What does that mean? There's someone who came in contact with Tumah, and then the question is whether the Tumah, whether the Basar, I should say, was contracted Tumah. So let's say, for example, there's a suffix if the person who is Tameh, if a person who is definitely Tameh, we have a suffix if he touched another person. We don't know if Reuven came in contact in Maga with Shimon or not. This would be like Sotah, because that's Yesh Bo Das Lishol of both the Nogea and the Magia. Right? He can ask, number one, did he contract tumah? Number two, did the Basar contract tumah? But let's say there was to be a case where it's Ein Das Ela B'Nogea. Only the Nogea has Das, but not the Magia. For example, we don't know if a person touched a sheretz. So wasn't that the issue was Reuven came in contact with Shimon? In that case, we have a double Yesh Bo Das. But if the question is whether Reuven came in contact with the sheretz that's Metami is Ein Bo Das Lishon. And we would not know that in such a case we could be Metame. Therefore, we need the drush of Rav Gidol Marav to establish that one single Yesh Bo Das Lishon is enough to generate the halach of Safek Kirada. Okay. Now, by way of introduction to the sugi of Tumah V'Tara that we're about to embark upon, we have something called an Avatuma, which is Metame Adam V'Kelim and Ochlin Umashkin, straight across the board. Like, for example, a sheretz is an Avatuma. Now, when this sheretz comes in contact with a kli, that's called a Rishon L'Tumah. A rishon l'tuma is not metame adam v'kelim, but only ochlin umashkin. We'll see exactly what that means. So let's say there were ochlin umashkin inside a kli, and the kli became a rishon l'tum because the avatum of sheretz could be metame a keli to make it into a rishon. Now the ochlin umashkin become what's called a sheni l'tuma, because a sheretz who's metame adam kelim and make them into a rishon l'tuma, that rishon l'tuma cannot be metame adam kelim. It can only be metame ochlin umash. So let's say, for example, the sheretz who's an avatuma is metame a keli, and that keli becomes a rishon l'tuma. If there are kelim inside that inside those kelim, they would remain tah, because a rishon l'tuma can only be metame ochlin umash, but not kelim the other. Next, now we have a sheretz that was metame a kli. The kli is a rishon, and it was metame ochlin umashkin. That makes it into sheni l'tuma. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai will teach us that a sheni l'tuma could not be metame ochlin umashkin to make them into a shlishi b'tuma, with the exception of truma. Truma becomes nifsala me'achila as a shlishi l'tuma. Now we have another halacha with regard to basar kodshim, that if the shlishi l'tuma comes in contact with basar kodshim, it makes the basar kodshim into a revi l'tuma, and that would passel the basar kodshim. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, is going to tell us that ochlin umashkin can become a sheni l'tuma, and they can be metami mashkin v'ochlin achirim. Again, we have to specify. Ochel is metami mashkin, and only mashkin. Mashkin is metami ochel, and that's Rabbi Akiva in Psachim Daf Yud Ches. Now we get to Kli Cheres. Kli Cheres has its own din as far as Tumah V'Tara. It's different than all other kelim. It's not metame when the sheretz falls on the outside of the kli, b'negias sheretz b'dofnei kli, but rather only if it enters into the inside of the airspace of the kli, and then the Kli Cheres becomes tameh, even though there was no direct maga between the sheretz and the kli. And therefore, the Kli Cheres is metame everything inside. Bo bayom, on that day when they appointed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Dorash Rabbi Akiva, the Chol Kli Cheres, Asher Yipol Mehem El Tocho, Kol Asher B'Tocho Yitma. Rabbi Akiva is going to darshan what we call kiksava, which means we look at the letters in the Torah, we change the vocalization. And he's going to read the word yitma as if it said yitame. And that means that kol asher b'tocho, anything that was inside the Kli Cheres, and the Kli Cheres contracted tumah from the sheretz, is not only tameh, but it has the power to be metame. And from this, Rabbi Akiva derives that ochel becomes a sheni l'tuma as a result of the kli, which means that ochel could transmit tuma if it comes in contact with other ochlim that make it into a shlishi l'tuma, and that applies even to chulin. Now, Rabbi Yeshua made a comment that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would used to say that Lagabi Truma, it doesn't say in the Torah that a Sheni L'Tuma would be Metami Truma. We derive it from a Kal V'chomer, and therefore he said that down the line in future generations, they're going to be Mitayar the Truma as a Shlishi. But Rabbi Akiva finds a source in the Torah for Shlishi L'Tuma, even in the case of Chulin. So the Gemara now raises the following question. And this is a question that's directed to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, you don't have a basis in the Torah to be metame a kikar shel truma that came in contact with a sheni l'tuma is lamatame. So why, in fact, is the truma excluded? And the answer is on Rabbi Yehuda Merav min Torah emo, but midin kal v'chomer yeshla. That Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai derives the psul of truma b'shlishi from a kal v'chomer from Tvul Yom. And we'll see how there's going to be a pirch on that kal v'chomer. So Tvul Yom is someone who goes to the mikvah, but he has to wait till Hariv Shemesh. And he's mutar b'chulin. As soon as he goes into the mikvah, he's allowed to eat chulin. And that's derived from a pasuk in Vayikra Chav Beis, v'lo yochal min hakadoshim ki im rochatz b'sar b'mayim. That means from the moment that he was rochetz b'sar b'mayim, he becomes tar as far as chulin is concerned. Or, for example, as far as Ma'aser Rishon is concerned, because Ma'aser Rishon has the identical status as chulin. And this is all based on a Gemara in Yevamah Staf Ayin Dalet in Beis. There are 3 psukim in a Tomish Nitar, which means that there are 3 different zmanim as to when the Tomei becomes tar. And the Gemara there explains that after he was tovel, he's allowed to eat chulin and maser. After Erev Shemesh, he's allowed to eat truma. And in certain cases, he has to bring a carbon to complete his process of tara. And the carbon is necessary to be mater him to eat kodshim. So we have 3 levels. And nevertheless, posel b'truma. And the din, the status of the Tvul Yom, is that according to Torah law, as the Gemara derives in Masechet Shabbos Daf Yudalid Amid Beis, a Tvul Yom is posel b'truma. Right? We said that a Tvul Yom who has not yet experienced Hariv Shemesh is not allowed to eat truma. He's enjoined from truma until after Hariv Shemesh. So he, as a Tvul Yom, is not allowed to eat truma. But now we're going a step further, and we're saying that if he comes in contact with truma, the Torah law is that the truma is psula. So it means that the tuma of Tvul Yom, with regard to truma, is a tuma haposelis. And now we're ready for the Kal V'chomer. Kikar. Now we have a kikar that came in contact with a Rishon L'Tuma, became a Sheni L'Tuma, Shepasul B'Truma, B'Chulin, excuse me. It means it's tummy even as far as Chulin are concerned. It is based on a pasuk by Yikra Yud Aleph in the parsha of Kli Cheres, where Sheretz fell into it. It says, Kol Asher B'Tocho Yitma. Is a nodin sheyase shlishi b'truma. If a Tvul Yom is posel b'truma, then a kikar, which is a rishon l'tum. You see, the whole Gemara is based on the principle that a Tvul Yom is a sheni l'tuma, and the din that a Tvul Yom through his contact with truma passes the truma is because truma becomes a shlishi l'tuma. So that if a Tvul Yom is a sheni l'tuma, and it makes truma into a shlishi l'tuma. Then a kikar, which is a rishon l'tuma. I'm sorry. What I meant to say is a kikar that comes in contact with a rishon l'tuma becomes a sheni l'tuma, and now it passes chulin, so it's considered tamei even as far as chulin is concerned. Whereas a tful yom who's a sheni is not considered a tamei as far as chulin. So therefore, in the case of a kikar that became a sheni l'tuma, which means it's metame even chulin, then eno din sheyasa shlishi b'truma. So we now have a derivation from the Torah that that truma as a shlishi is psula, and that's derived from a kal v'chomer. So why is Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai so worried about future generations? Equal and mifrach, because there's a pirch on this kal v'chomer. Malu tful yom as a tuma chamura, shekain av hatuma. Which means that if a person contracts tumas mes, or for that matter, a zav or a mitzora, that have the status of an avatuma, so that a tful yom is considered yesh b'mino nasa avatuma, and that makes it into tuma chamura even after he was tovel, because the tumah itself is a tuma chamura. But this kikar could never become an avatuma, because ochin umashkin maximum could become either a rishon or a sheni, but could never become an avatuma. So tful yom has within him that chumrah of, let's call it the avatuma of mes or zav or mitzora, and that's why it has the power to passel truma b'mago. But in the case of a kikar, and now we're talking about again a kikar that touched a rishon l'tuma, became a sheni l'tuma, maybe it would not be able to passel truma because it never had the possibility of being a rishon l'tuma. Because ochin umashkin can never be a rishon l'tuma. So the Gemara now says, Pesi, we could learn and derive from a kal v'chomer mitful yom desheretz. So now we're turning to Daf Chavtes Omid Beis. So it means a person contracted tumas sheretz. He came in contact with the sheretz. Well, for that matter, a kli came in contact with the sheretz. And then this Adam or this Keli went into mikvah and now has the status of a tful yom to sheretz. So in such a case, there's no possibility of avatuma. There's only a rishon l'tuma. It's not like the case of a Tomei Mes or a Mitzora or a Zav that had a rishon l'tuma. Now we're talking about a tful yom of a sheretz. The tful yom of a sheretz were not an avatuma. It was only a rishon l'tuma. The sheretz himself is an avatuma, and the nogeabo becomes a rishon l'tuma. And yet, the tful yom de sheretz passes truma b'magon. So it comes out, and this is all based on Rashi, now is Sugya, Dibra Masa Mitabel, Mitvul Yom, excuse me, that a Tvul Yom passes Truma b'mago min HaTorah. Because the Torah says in a clear Tvul Yom, it says in Vayikra Yidal b'mayim yuva v'tomei ad ha'orev v'toyer. So this pasuk requires Tvila and Harav Shemesh, and it's referring to Truma. So since this pasuk is related to Kalim, relates to Kalim, and there's no Achil, it's only Negia, the Gemara Darshans and Yivamis Ayin Hey, that a Tvul Yom passes Truma b'Negia, and so too an Adam Tvul Yom. So from this Tvul Yom to Sheretz, we can derive a couple of chomer to a kikar that's a sheni and pasels chulin, that it should pasel truma b'mago. So the Gemara says even so there's a pircha. Malu Tvul Yom to Sheretz. Tvul Yom of Sheretz also has a chumra that a kikar sheni does not have. Shekain b'mino avatuma, because in the case of an adam or a kli, he could become Tomei as an Avatuma by having a contact with a mess. And he's Metame Adam V'Kelim as an Avatuma. A Kikar could never become an Avatuma. It could maximum become a Rishon or a Sheni L'Tum. And now the Gemara rejects that Pircha. Kli Cheres Yochia. If a Sheretz falls into a Kli Cheres, and the klicheres now contracts tuma, that's a case of ein b'mino av hatuma, because we're talking about a keli, and yet it passes truma. So again, a klicheres could never become an avatuma, and it's metame ochlin umashkin of klulin and truma if the ochlin umashkin entered into the klicheres after the sheretz was in the aver of the klicheres. Now, if the ochlin umashkin of chulin become tummy, then how much more so the truma becomes psula? And he writes here, "Sharei ein atam sheyesh b'minu avatuma gorem lifsos hatruma v'imkein yesh lilmo dehu adin kikar sheni posel truma av she'enu nasa truma." So Gemara says, "What do you mean? You're going to derive conclusions from klicheres? Malik klicheres shekei metami avira." This is the most unique and severe kind of tumah that we know of in the entire constellation of tumah. Because what happens? There was no maga with the kli cheres, only the sheretz came into the aver of the kli without having contact with the gufa kli. And yet the Torah says that the kli is tameh. A kikar could only become tameh through maga. And therefore it's possible that because of this special chumrah of kli cheres, it passes truma. But we cannot derive any conclusions from Kli Cheres to a Kikar Sheni. And Gemara answers Tvul Yom Yochia. But now we go back to Tvul Yom. Because in the case of Tvul Yom, the psul of Truma is not dependent upon any chumrah of Mitami Me'aviro. Sharei Kliya Roy Litvila Posel Truma. Afshe ein bo chumra zu ve'enu mitami ela b'negia. V'chozer adin lo roi zeh k'roi zeh. And now we have a question of what's called a tzad hashavim. Lo roi zeh k'roi zeh. In other words, there's a chumrah in each case which is different. The chumrah of a Tvul Yom is not the chumrah of a kli cheres. So we're not going to say, therefore, that the chumrah of a kli cheres that's metami me'aviro is the gorem, that it's metami truma, because that chumrah doesn't exist in Tvul Yom. But let's flip it the other way. The chumrah of a kli cheres is not the same as the chumrah of a Tvul Yom. So therefore, we're not going to say that the chumrah of a Tvul Yom, that yesh b'mino avatuma, is the gorem of it being able to be metami truma. because this chumrah doesn't apply to a kli cheres. So each one has its own chumrah. The kli cheres has the chumrah that's mitami aviro, and the tful yom has the chumrah is yesh b'mino avatuma. So if in each case we could prove from the other one that chumrah is not what's gorim the din of mitami truma, hatzad shava shebahen, shemutarim b'chulin uposlim b'truma. But tful yom and a kli cheres are considered b'toras tmeim. They passel truma. It's called shkein kikar sheni, that a kikar becomes a sheni l'tuma. Sheposel b'chulin, how much more so vadai de posel b'truma. So now the Gemara asks v'dar achar. So why is Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai worried about a later generation that's going to be entire the truma as a shlishi? We already have a tzad shava. Horich mal tzad shava sheven shikein yesh b'hem tzad chomur. So this is a fundamental issue in the mechanism and the application of tzad shava. What happens if the two parts of the tzad shava each has its own unique chumrah that doesn't apply to the other one, right? Tful yom is yesh b'mino avatum, kli cheres is metami aviro, and kikar sheni doesn't have any of those two chumras, right? It doesn't size up neither to tful yom nor to kli cheres, and the problem is that if these both are coming to teach us about a kikar sheni, and both of these that are on the malamdim have each in its own respective way of chumrah, and ein chumrah shel zu kish chumrah shel zu, can we derive it tzad shava? I'm going to say that no. In both cases, the psul of truma is based on a chumrah. I don't know what that chumrah is. In each case, a different chumrah. But Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai tzad chumrah lo parich. His shita is that we could derive a tzad shava despite the fact that there's a tzad chomer in both cases, because the tzad chomer is not common to both cases. Tanya Rabbi Yossi minayin l'revi b'kodesh apostle. So we've established that a shlishi in truma exists. What about a revi? There's no revi in truma, but there is a revi in basar kodshim. And Rabbi Yossi wants to know, from whence do we derive this conclusion? Vidinu. We're going to derive it from a kal v'chomer. Now, Zav, Zavi, Aletis, and Mitzorah, 4 categories that are called Mechusa Kippurim. So that even though they were Tovel on the last day, and they had Harav Shemesh, they still have to bring their korbanos, and they're not allowed to eat kodshim until they bring their korbanos. That's called Mechusa Kippurim. But the Mechusa Kippura is allowed to eat truma, to be truma. And this is again in Gemara and Yevamos Daf Ayin Daled Amud Beis that has a drasha to teach me Uba Shemesh v'Tor v'Achar Yocham and HaKodshim, that a Tomei Shetaval v'Hiriv Shemsho is allowed to eat truma even though he hasn't brought his korban. But possible, but Kodesh, he's not allowed to eat kodshim until he brings his kapar, his korban, on the next day, usually Yom Shmini. Is shlishi sheposel b'truma ino din shehu yaser revi b'kodesh. So he said that a shlishi that comes in contact with, a sheni that comes in contact with truma, apostles the truma as a shlishi. And now you're not allowed to eat the truma as a shlishi, then certainly that shlishi should passel kodshim b'mago to make the kodshim into revi b'kodesh. There's a whole discussion here whether this is a full-fledged kal v'chomer. Rashi assumes the kal v'chomer gomer. Now here we have a problem because one of the restrictions and limitations that apply to a kal v'chomer is dayu levam and adin lios kinadu. You can't. The nidon, the nilmad, cannot be greater and supersede the malamed. Now, truma we only have in truma shlishi and not a revi. So how can you derive from Truma, which is only a Shlishi, that in Kodesh, meaning a Basar Kodshim, there's a Psul of Ravi. V'lamadnu Shlishi leKodesh min HaTorah, u'Ravi mikal v'chomer. So the Gemara is going to quote later a pasuk from which we derive Shlishi leKodesh. Now we need a Kal V'chomer, not for Shlishi b'Kodesh, because that's already mefurish in the pasuk, as we'll see, but rather to derive Revi b'Kodesh. So now we're going to apply Dayal Levom and Adin Lios Kinodin. You can't apply a Kal V'chomer here. However, in a place where the Kal V'chomer is batel legamre, and therefore the Kal V'chomer would not teach me anything, then we don't apply the principle of Dayal Levom and Adin Lios Kinodun, and that's Rashi based on Psachim Daf Yud Ches. And the Gemara explains, Shlishi leKodesh min HaTorah min Alon. How do we know that in Kodshim, Basar Kodshim, there's something called a Psul of Shlishi? That's mefurish in the pasuk Tiksiv, in the parasha that we quoted earlier of Shlomim, Korban Shlomim, with regard to Achilas HaBasar, Vayikra Zayim HaBasar, Shayiga B'chol Tomei Lo Yeyochel. And we're going to be medayik from the pasuk B'chol Tomei. What does B'chol Tomei indicate? Milo askinon de noga b'sheni, that the basar had contact with a sheni l'tuma, and that's included in the B'chol Tomei, and that's based on a parsha in Shrotzim in Vayikra Yidal B'chol Kli Cheres asher yipol me'em el tocho kol asher b'tocho yitma, that the ochel inside of the kli is a sheni l'tuma, and it's called tameh. And therefore, this basar that came in contact with a sheni becomes a shlishi l'tuma, rachmana lo yeyochel. And yet the Torah says that bechol tameh lo yeyochel. So we see mefurish in the Torah that a shlishi l'tuma apostles in kodshim. And now we can derive from a Kal V'chomer Revi. And again, we're not going to apply the principle of Dayo because that would undermine the entire Kal V'chomer. So now the Gemara is going to analyze Rabbi Yossi. Omer Rabbi Yochanan, Tam Beribi. Beribi means a Chacham Gadol Vadar. Gadol Adar, that's Rabbi Yossi. Eini Yodea Mahu. I don't understand how he could derive this Kal V'chomer from Mechusar Kippurim to establish that a Revi b'Kodesh is possible. Shrei Tshuvasa b'Tzida. We have a built-in pircha to the Kal V'chomer. Ochel Abba Machmas Tful Yom Yochia. If you have an ochel of Truma, or for that matter of Kodshim, that came in contact with a Tful Yom, that's going to prove that this Kal V'chomer from Mechusar Kapara, that passes Truma, passes Kodshim, B'Negia. Why? Ochel Zeh Shenagabal Tful Yom Pasul B'Truma V'Eina Oser Revi B'Kodesh. In the case of a Tful Yom, if it had contact with Truma, it passes the Truma, but if it had contact with Kodshim, then it doesn't create a psul of kodshim. So therefore, from the case of Tful Yom, we prove, or let's say we disprove the Kal V'chomer. The Sanya B'Shol Omer, Tful Yom, which means that he was already Tovil, but Loba Halayla was before Hariv Shemesh. And as we said earlier, his status is that of a sheni l'tumah, and he's not metame chulin at all, because chulin did not become a shlishi. He passes truma because truma that came in contact with the sheni becomes a psul shlishi, and it passes kodesh, meaning basa kodshim, to become a revi b'kodesh. So the shlishi makes a revi. Now, here we come to the Rabbanos. If Noga b'basa kodshim, then the Chachamim made a maila that a tful yom tchila l'kodesh, l'tami shnayim. That a tful yom is a rishon as far as kodesh is concerned, to be metami it such that it create a shnayim, meaning a tumah of shtei dargos. So they become tameh, and they metami the ochal asher yiga b'hem, v'lifsol echad and one achreim, shu tameh ach lo yitami achad. So since a tful yom is considered a rishon, the kodesh that comes in contact with him is considered a sheni. That's metami kodesh that comes in contact to become a shlishi, and that could passel kodesh with contact to make it into a revi. So this is all the sheet of Abba Shaul. Rabbi Meir disagrees. Rabbi Meir, he never accepted this gzeres chachamim that we consider a tful yom as far as kodesh could be to be a rishon l'tumah. But dino legabi kodesh kedino legabi truma is nechshav kisheni l'tumah, only kisheni l'tumah. That's the dorai. So we never accepted gzeres chacham to make him into a rishon l'tumah, and therefore, if he comes in contact with kodshim, he's mitame echad, only one darga, and that means the darga of a shlishi. So he's metame kodesh and nogabo uposel echad. So he becomes tameh, but he's not metame others. Echad meaning darga achas liachrev. So the nogeh b'shlishi is tameh, but he doesn't passel those who come in contact with him. The chachamim omrim, ein tful yom nechshav afilu kisheni l'tumah sheyasa shlishi revi. The din and the status of a tful yom, as far as the Torah law is, it passes shumen kodshim b'mago, but they don't have the tumah that could pass on and transmit tumah tacherim. And therefore, kishem sheposel ochle truma mashke truma, they're not metame truma v'kodshim. Is kach posel ochle kodesh umashke kodesh. They're not metame kodshim that came in contact with them. The Gemara understood that Rabbi Yossi holds like the Chachamim that truma kodshim that came in contact with the tful yom become possible, but it cannot transmit that psul of kodshim to others that came in contact with them. And therefore, we now have a question on Rabbi Yossi. If a psul truma passes kodshim b'maga, and that's what he derives from a chusar kapara, then we should derive from a kavachomer that even to eat la'ochel for foodstuff, shenifsal b'negias tful yom, sheyifsal es hakodshim b'mago. And why is that? Because ochel and ogeh b'tful yom is nifsal b'truma. So it must be that this kavachomer is not, kavachomer from chusar kapara is not a valid Kal v'chomer to derive that the psul truma passes kodshim b'negiah. And now, after Rabbi Yochanan raises his objection to Rabbi Yossi, Rav Papa raises an objection on the objection to Rabbi Yochanan. Maskif la Rav Papa mimai the Rabbi Yossi ki Rabbanan svirulei. You, Rabbi Yochanan, are assuming a premise that's not proven. Namely, that Rabbi Yossi holds like the Rabbanon, that it's full yom, it's not Matami Truma Kodshim. It only apostles them, but they cannot transmit the Tumah. Dilma Kabashal spiritually. Perhaps Rabbi Yossi accepted the sheet of Abashal, the Omar, who holds that on a Torah level, Nechshav Sheni L'Tumah, Shemitami Truma Li'ol Shlishi. So that Truma becomes a Shlishi L'Tumah, which means that through contact with Kodshim, it passes the Kodshim and makes them into a V. And since we learn a Kavachon from a Chusa Kapara, they call apostle betruma kolshkein sheposel bekodshim, and that was the drasha of Yossi that we had above. But the Chachamim made a mila bekodshim that if the kodshim come in contact with other kodshim, it's considered like the Tvul Yom was not a sheni l'tum, but rather a rishon l'tum, l'tame shnayim v'lifs alecha. So if Rabbi Yossi holds a kabashol, then Rabbi Yochanan's kasha falls by the wayside. And we could derive a kavachom from a chusuk kippurim that it becomes a shlishi, and therefore could create a reveal kodesh. So Gemara rejects Rav Papa. That a Tvul Yom is considered on a Doraisa level only a sheni l'tuma. And a truma that came in contact becomes a shlishi and passes kodshim to make it into a V. Based on the kavachom from a chusuk kapara, is laite l'revi b'kodesh may ochel sheba machmas Tvul Yom. You should derive the revi of kodesh with a kavachomer from ochel sheba machmas Tvul Yom. You don't need the kavachom from a chusuk kapara. You could have said the following: Ma ochel truma kodshim haba machmas negia of a Tvul Yom, the Tvul Yom gufe. Tvul Yom himself is mutar b'chulin. He doesn't create a psul at all. He's considered tar legabi psulin, and nevertheless amritz. Nevertheless, is this ochel oser revi b'kodesh? Is ochel shel truma shenase shlishi haba machmas sheni? In other words, it was nitma because of an egia with the ochel that's a sheni l'tuma. The sheni gufa iser aser b'chulin eno dinsha oser revi b'kodesh. So this Kal V'chomer Yirtzeh Hashem we'll try to pick up in greater depth tomorrow. Hashem at 7:15. We'll start a little earlier on Friday. Okay, then. So let me wish you a great day, and thank you very much.